Okay, looks like it's a good time to get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Together Outdoors webinar series, and this one is about best practices for equitable and impactful grant making and outdoor recreation. I'm really excited for this session today. This is kicking off our series, but it's one of my most important and a topic that I'm very passionate about. So a little bit about myself. My name's Embry Tariq. I am the Senior Program Director here at Outdoor Recreation Roundtable, which is a coalition of our industry's associations, and among those members represents 110,000 businesses across the country, across every sector in our industry. And Together Outdoors is the equity program within ORR, where we are intersectional with all the work from workforce to state offices to advocacy, and making sure that we are thinking about the sustainability of our industry through a lens of people, right? Like our ultimate goal is about growing outdoor recreation. And if we want to do that, we need to make sure that we are increasing access and diversity throughout our stakeholders. So we want more workers, we want more businesses, we want more entrepreneurs and customers. All of this benefits from diversity and increasing access. So that is the premise of our mission at Together Outdoors. And one of the programs that we're very proud to run is a inclusive microgrant program, which is really focused on trying to get capacity building and support to those grassroots organizations and those folks on the ground who are doing the critical work of bridging the adventure gap. They're the ones in the communities building trust and getting folks out into the outdoors, introducing them to formative and joyful experiences. Yet oftentimes, these small organizations are the least likely to be invested in because philanthropy as a whole, while it's an incredibly powerful mechanism for us to push for social change, the way it is set up and the inherent biases that exist in that system have created a situation where these small grassroots organizations, rural organizations, are often falling through the cracks because they cannot afford to compete through the grant making process, right? The application process and the administration process is extremely time and resource intensive. So our award-winning Inclusive Microgrant program really focused on that, learning from the principles of trust-based grant making. We approached it with that ethos, trying to strip away and streamline the process so that approaching it with, we believe our applicants and our grantees, we're forming an investment together. So that's what really our session is going to be about. I'm really excited to introduce the panelists who do this and they're experts in this industry. Before I do that, I just want to mention that we have some exciting news about our grant program. Thanks to Winnebago Industries coming through with some extra funding, we were able to provide grants to two more organizations, and this is the first that we're able to announce them from Rising Routes and Color My Outdoors, and we'll be able to share more about them in the press release and social media we're going to do after this event. After that as well, we're going to be creating a business resource guide, a sort of fact sheet or best practices guide to help capture a lot of the conversation we're having today and really set out a simple pathway in how businesses and donors can engage in trust-based grant making in their own context. So to kick this all off, I am so excited to introduce our panelists for today, who is Jill Littlejohn Bostick, Vice President of Corporate Responsibility and Inclusion at Winnebago Industries, Lesford Duncan, Executive Director of Outdoor Foundation, and Darren Josie, founder of First Seed Sown. The way these webinars work is that we are actually all friends, and we have these conversations often after an event, between events, when we're planning projects. And, there's some really, really powerful and amazing lessons that we share with each other. So we thought, hey, why don't we take these conversations and bring them to the whole community? So the way it's going to work is I'm going to throw some questions at my friends here after they introduce themselves, and we're going to be chatting about it. And If you have questions throughout the conversation, please put them in the Q&A function so that we have a way of addressing them at the end when we do our Q&A portions, but also so we can stay in communication after the event and help as a community answer these questions. So I will now turn it over to my friend Jill to introduce herself, Les, and then Darren, and then we'll get started.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ambreen. So excited to be here with everyone. Again, I work at Winnebago Industries and I lead our corporate responsibility and inclusion program. But I also am the executive director for our corporate foundation. I became passionate about the outdoors during my time here at Winnebago Industries, but I also have experience leading nonprofit organizations. So I've been on the other side to receive those funds. And so now it's a really great opportunity to be able to help influence what it looks like from the funding side. So really excited to dive into the conversation, and I will turn it over to Les.
Thanks so much, Jill. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join and to engage in this robust conversation. And as Embreen mentioned, I'm just really excited to chop it up with my colleagues here in a conversation that will hopefully shed some light on equitable practices and grant making. My name is Lesford Duncan, pronouns he, him, and I'm the executive director of the Outdoor Foundation, the philanthropic arm of the outdoor industry dedicated to increasing equitable access to nature and outdoor recreation, increasing participation in outdoor recreation, and we do that primarily through community investments. And I'll talk a little bit more about our Thrive Outside initiative, our primary grant making mechanism, as well as outdoor participation research as well. Just a little history, my history with the Outdoor Foundation. I was initially one of the community leaders for the Thrive Outside initiative in San Diego years back when I was working with a nonprofit called Outdoor Outreach. Moved to Atlanta, served on the board of the foundation, and then stepped into the role as executive director at the beginning of the year. But more important than that, in a way, prior to coming into outdoor recreation, I worked in health and human services. And in that time and space, especially working on and leading programs that help to support youth that have experienced trauma and adversity, I got to see firsthand how connection to nature and outdoor recreation improves the health, the well-being, the resilience of individuals and communities. And so excited in this role and in this capacity to help enable that essential work across communities across the US. And I'll pass it over to my good friend Darren, or DJ.
Thanks, Les, and thank you all to OR and Together Outdoors. Very thankful to be a grantee for this year. My name is Darren Josie, I go by DJ, and I've had a 15-year career in the outdoor industry, and y'all ain't getting rid of me. I'm staying here forever. I've spent a lot of time working for a bunch of household brands you've heard of in the industry, like Vibram, Polartec, and Nemo Equipment, in both a sales and marketing capacity. And about a year and a half ago, I decided to start my own company, First Seed Sown, and I really focused on something that I felt was missing during my career. As someone who is Black and Puerto Rican, I did not have any other family who went spent time outside. I didn't really have friends who spent time outside, and it was my job in the industry that let me experience all these awesome things that shaped who I am today, from the partner I chose to marry to where I live and what I pass down to my children. So it's really important to me the work to focus on two parts that my company does. I support BIPOC owned companies in sales and marketing consulting, and I work with municipalities to build outdoor enablement campaigns. I think there's so much that traditional sports have learned through rec departments and going a municipal first approach, and I want our industry to do the same. And excited to talk more about that with all of you.
Love it. And so as y'all can see from Jill, Les, and Darren, we have private companies, we have foundations, we have consulting side. So their expertise in these different contexts is really important as we talk about this, because the point of all of this is that it's actually very accessible for us all in whatever capacity that we're involved with being donors to be able to incorporate this, right? And I was mentioning a little bit in the beginning about how traditional grant making process have because of the inherent biases that are built in, like looking at funding actual organizations, brick and mortars, and oftentimes larger groups, and the same folks keep getting funded because the system is set up to be able to meet their needs and not necessarily the kinds of groups we're going to talk about today. And so there is insufficient distribution of funds among smaller and rural organizations. A few years ago, I started an organization called Brown People Camping, and that's where I actually learned this firsthand because I have been alongside a lot of BIPOC organizations and affinity groups who are getting their communities outdoors, and I know firsthand how this is the front line of our industry in terms of growing it and growing it sustainably. And so it's very, very important for us to understand that beyond the structure of nonprofit, there are a lot of people who are in the universe of impacting accessibility and the growth of our industry. And we want to figure out ways to get our investments to them, right? So in looking at that, I want to dive in straight ahead and ask you, and I'll start off with Jill, from personal experiences, because you obviously, since we are one of your grantees, you obviously have a lot of experience in trust-based philanthropy. So can you share a teachable example from personal experience from when it worked, as in when you use certain trust-based granting practices to provide funding to an organization where you felt money really made it to the ground and made a difference in that community as a result of those practices that you used?
Yes, thanks, Amber. I think it really goes back to who we are as a company, right? So Winnebago Industries, we're an outdoor lifestyle company that manufactures RVs and boats, and we believe in elevating every moment outdoors. And so if you're going to elevate every moment outdoors, that means that everyone needs to be a part of that outdoors. And so when it comes to the concept of trust-based philanthropy, what I will say is that we're still on the journey. We're still trying to figure it out. And so I like the way that you phrased the question in terms of what are some of the principles that we've applied, because I think sometimes people think that it's all in trust-based. You have to, do it a certain way. And if it doesn't happen that way, then you're out of line, right? And so for us, it's really about making sure that we are connecting people to the outdoors and that they have access. And so when I think about this question, it's so hard to think about one particular example. So I'm going to do 3 really quick ones. And so what I'll say in those 3 really quick ones, I think it would be difficult to not identify that we have 2 of our grantees on this call, right? So Ambreen with Together Outdoors, which Ambreen has already mentioned, that we help to fund the Inclusive Micro Grants program. And that in itself is an option of trust-based philanthropy. It is saying that we have the funds, we don't have the ability to give to organizations who may not be a 501c3 and may not, they may not be a 501c3, but they are doing the work to get people into the outdoors. And so through our relationship with ORR and Together Outdoors, we're able to fund that program. And we've seen the work. We've seen how people are using the grants and really getting people into the outdoors. And so, I'll start there with that being one really quick example. And then, of course, my friend Les with the Outdoor Foundation and, the Thrive Outside initiative. And so with that, it's also kind of a pass through of sorts in terms of having these communities on the ground who are doing the work, right? And so that trust-based principle is saying, here are the things that you're saying that you want to do. And then, coming back and providing and saying, here's what we did, here's what worked, but also here's what didn't work. And I think that that's where sometimes people get confused with granting practices, because sometimes things don't always go the way that you plan them to go. But when you're really building a relationship with organizations, you have a relationship and you can talk through those initiatives. And so, those were 2 that I couldn't not talk about with having both of you on the ground. And then for my final example, again, we are looking to bring more people into the outdoors. And, I started here 3 years ago. And there was an organization that approached us, Melanated Campout. and they approached us. Their mission was to get Black and brown people into the outdoors. They were a newer organization, so they did have their 501c3 status, but they were still really new. And so there were some of the initiatives. And so we started to fund their capacity building to help them get what they needed to be successful. And when I think back over the past 3 years, we started off, I've attended, and they probably had 250 people who were camping in RVs, in tents, in log cabins, to this past year where they had over 500 people that attended, right? And so to me, that's really an example of trusting the people who do the work to know what's best and how to use those funds to really get people in the outdoors versus saying you have to use these dollars to do this. The goal is to get people outdoors. And if you can do that, then we want to be able to fund those programs.
Absolutely. And I think you made so many incredible points. The last one being, and I jumped right into it without actually defining what is trust-based philanthropy. At the heart of it is the very basic premise that I trust you. You're applying for this grant and I trust you, right? I'm not going to make you jump through all these hoops. I'm not going to make you report regularly on all of these metrics. And I trust that you know what is important and how to measure its success. So in that approach, not only streamlining and taking down some of these onus requirements, like instead of a long application process, TO made it whatever format you want to put it in, just answer these 3-4 questions that we really need to know, or put it in a 3-minute video. That was an innovation that we did. And it's like what Jill was saying about flexibility and nimbleness. And that is also at the heart of trust-based philanthropic approach, is that we are risk-taking. We are trying different things, and different formats are going to fit for different communities. And part of this work is knowing that you have to be nimble, be flexible, and innovate. And sometimes you have to pivot. And that is part of how we're going to discover the actual impactful practices. So thank you so much for sharing that, Jill, and for making as one of your great examples. The next question, I'm gonna ask you this less about, you mentioned a bit about Outdoor Foundation's Thrive Outside initiative and how you invest through a collective impact approach. Could you share a bit more about how it relates to trust-based granting principles, the way that you operate your program?
Yeah, absolutely. And just want to say mic drops on Jill and Embreen. I think a lot of my notes will kind of piggyback off of or build off of what they've already shared. As I mentioned, the Outdoor Foundation, we invest primarily through our Thrive Outside initiative, an initiative that we kicked off about 5 years ago, and was widely supported, and has been widely supported through incredible outdoor industry partners, including Winnebago, VF Foundation, LL Bean, REI, and several others, as well as the Outdoor Industry Association itself, and leveraging funding from this broader membership there as well. And to date, we've invested nearly $5 million in funding to 13 communities across the country that are doing collective impact work. Now, what is collective impact? Often when we use that term in the philanthropic space, in the nonprofit and public sector, we use it kind of loosely, but I wanted to really go back to Stanford's definition of it, as this came out of the Stanford Social Innovation Review article several years back. It defines 5 core pillars of collective impact: a coalition that really comes together around a common agenda, shared measurement systems, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and that has a strong backbone support organization that is helping to serve as a glue to bring that together. How does that relate to this work, right? So prior to shifting to this collective impact approach, we were investing directly in community-based programs and organizations to help support additional programming. And that's essential in this work as well. And we have several philanthropic partners that also support that direct work. But as I talk about the glue that really holds a community together, that brings partners together, and that essentially creates the rising tide that raises all boats, that is leveraging the coalition's effort to bring in additional resources into their respective regions, communities, or cities, bringing together a shared common agenda and common metrics to help evaluate the success of programs and helping to build capacity, especially of, as Embreen mentioned, BIPOC-led organizations, smaller community-based organizations to be able to show up in this work in a greater way. So investing essentially in the sustainability of the work and the glue that holds this work together. Over the past 5 years, we've seen tremendous success across our communities. So some of their efforts included innovative program partnerships that were developed across coalitions between outdoor recreation organizations and mental health agencies, or outdoor programs and entire school districts to help make outdoor recreation an everyday part of children, youth, and families' lives, and to really quantify and to talk about the benefits of outdoor recreation across multiple domains, beyond kind of the sphere or the bubble that most of us know working in the outdoor recreation space. How does this relate to trust-based philanthropy? As was mentioned before, part of it is doing the deep work to get to know the communities that you work with. And so our grant making process is a little different than most. We don't typically have an open RFP process. What we do and what we continuously do is we review and assess communities. We went through a heat mapping process at the beginning of the Thrive Outside initiative that identified communities where there were the highest levels of barriers to access, and inequities in equitable access and outdoor recreation. We looked at communities where there was already some of the foundation or some of the organizations that were already working together, sometimes disjointedly, sometimes already collaboratively. And we looked at also the landscape of where our outdoor industry partners are as well. And we said, all right, what are some of the strategic communities where we believe that we can make the greatest difference? And have selected communities based on that. Those communities have done some phenomenal work, both again on that individual programmatic level, as well as on the policy level. For example, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Thrive Outside Grand Rapids helped to effectively pass a millage in that community that helps to increase equitable access to green spaces. They've also done an amazing job setting up a gear library in their region, as many other regions, including Thrive Outside Maine and several others, have done as well. Maine has also been really successful, Thrive Outside Maine, in advocating for and successfully securing state dollars to expand environmental education programming, climate education programming, and programming that helps to connect families with the gear that they need to enjoy outdoor recreation in their region as well. And these are just a few examples of the systems level change work that can happen through, again, that collective effort, right? The collective impact is not only happening at the community level, but it's happening also across outdoor industry. And we're incredibly grateful for the partners that invest through us in order to facilitate programs like the Thrive Outside initiative. And then a couple other things that I'll mention, and I'll shut up. Trust-based philanthropy also depends on, so not only getting to know the community, but also investing for the long term. So each community that we work with, we provide multi-year funding, commitments for multi-year funding. And that allows them to leverage that funding to bring in additional resources, allows them to plan to organize as a coalition. And it helps to fund capacity also beyond programs, which is one of the things that we hear most often from community-based organizations that we work with, is they need that back-end capacity beyond just programmatic support.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the first principles of trust-based approach is thinking about in wanting to make an investment and wanting to, help provide funding resources is realizing that I don't know what's best for the target issue or the target community that I'm trying to help. And that in recognizing that guides the way that you then approach in setting up that program. And I love the example of the heat mapping, because in understanding that I don't know what's best for the folks I'm trying to help, I will then approach practices to help me learn. And what's really important is recognizing that there are a lot of emerging issues that no matter how much you know a topic, the emerging issues, as we're now seeing, especially in our industry with like climate change and natural disasters, people need the flexibility. The folks that you're investing in, they need the flexibility to be able to direct funding and resources towards emerging issues or be able to take risks. Just because you're a grantee doesn't mean that you should be trapped in a specific format of work. Unrestricted long-term donations, allowing folks the capacity to take risks, pivot, and also redirect resources because they have to be nimble. They're small, right? And I think that's such a brilliant example, and hopefully we can all learn from the heat mapping description that you provided in understanding the community where you're trying to go.
Yeah, and Breen, if I could add to that also, because I described the heat mapping process as this like highly technical kind of scientific process, and where there's spreadsheets involved and all of that. But I failed to mention also, and this is the most critical part in our grant making also, we got to know the communities before
Yeah.
investing. We were on the ground, we were visiting, meeting with key community stakeholders to get to know not only the needs of the community, right? Like we talk about those most often, but also what are the assets, right? Like what's going well in this community that we can continue to build on there as well. And then we also work very closely with each community in the development of what becomes their network plan, right? And that is informed by and driven by, led by their coalition, right? It's not something that we are coming into and placing on a community. It's very much leveraging the work that's already happening and how can we come behind to give that extra push.
Yeah, and something that, I struggle with, no offense, Jill, but in writing grant applications is how do I take that knowledge and turn it into impact? How do I report out on impact? And what I'm learning through this is understanding the grantees' perspective of what impact and success means. So I would love to explore that too as we continue this conversation. But Darren, I wanted to ask you, as one of those models, like TO focuses, this the micro grant funding, another major principle for us is not limited to nonprofits or a specific type of structure and corporation. We say if you fall within the priority areas and you have an annual income of less than such and such, you are in the universe of this impact that you're making, you can apply. And Darren is such an excellent example of this. So I would love for you to give your insight as a consultant to the city of Malden, Massachusetts, right? And that project that we've invested in with you, this incredible work that you're doing for the city to build out your outdoor rec industry. What advice can you give to help funders better understand the biases and barriers that exist in traditional grant making and how to overcome them to make granting more equitable and really like based on your breadth of experience in this?
Sure, thank you. I'll first give maybe the short answer, then maybe the full background of what it is that I'm doing. So the short answer on how to make it more equitable and reduce barriers is not just offer grants to nonprofits. I'm a for-profit company. Maybe someday I can hand down this company, maybe I can sell it to someone, but to only limit nonprofits is really restricting, especially someone like myself, who I have a side of my business that is purely for profit. And the other side, where possible or where required, I use a fiscal sponsor in the city of Malden, who I have a full blessing and support to be that fiscal sponsor where needed. But it's really restricting to only, there's so many grants that I look at. I mean, I'm sure everyone knows it takes a long time to find the grant that's right for you. I'm someone who, before I started my own company, I've written 0 grants, and in the last year I've written 5, and I've won 4 out of 5, and I've out of 6, actually, I should say I've written 6, and there's one more that's pending that I'll find out hopefully next month. So it's something where I spend a lot of time going like, oh, that's only for nonprofits, or to find unrestricted grants. I am someone who my time, the money I got from this grant, I've rolled out 6 different programs in the city of Malden with that money, all paid for to diverse vendors, and then my own time. And to be able to pay myself to do this work is crucial because there's so much that I've seen on the grant writing side. That's like, okay, so here's this awesome program that I'm pitching. Am I going to be able to be paid to do this work? Like I can pay to get all the work done, but not the person to get it done. And that's really, really frustrating and puts you in a position where I have to make that decision. And I have done that. I've written several grants where I could not pay myself to do all that work, whether it's literally running around in a U-Haul van, getting bikes for kids to bring to a bike kitchen to coordinate, to running to meet the parks department because they unlock the door to get a bunch of other bikes and bring it to a bike kitchen to be fixed up, and then go deliver to people's houses because they don't have cars to pick bikes up. That's money spent of my time that I can really do and go out there and be active. Let me give you a little context on what I'm doing. The campaign that I put together is called the Great Malden Outdoors, and it is something that I'll be totally transparent. I want to roll out to every gateway city across the United States. As I mentioned earlier, the big professional sports leagues out there have so invested themselves into our communities that every single rec department has a soccer program, a football program, a basketball program, a tennis program, a baseball program, all these types of programs. Why not the outdoor industry? We don't need stadiums built to do what it is that we do. Why don't we have a hiking program, a rock climbing program? And the few that I have found are for very affluent, mostly white communities. Well, let's focus on these gateway communities. The issue is that your typical municipal or rec department does not know, understand, unless you maybe have someone in there who enjoys going outside. When I spent time meeting with the city council and the rec department, showing that we have birders from across the state coming to a site in Malden, they had no idea. I'm literally showing photos of where I go rock climbing in the city. The city councilor goes, I don't know, where is that? Or I knew about that place when I was a teenager because I drank there. So these are the barriers to overcome. And if you are willing to, as a foundation, as a government organization, as a private company who are creating these grants, to look at companies who are not nonprofits, who are taking non-traditional supports, and don't think that someone who's working on behalf of municipality, that municipalities have all types of money, that why aren't they just spending it on this? There's a cultural expectation that my town will have a soccer program for my children. I got 2 little girls, or a swimming program. I have gotten up at 5 in the morning to get on the wait list to get my girls into that program, to pay money for it. So, or that people can't afford this, right? I've rolled out bird watching classes that were $10 a pop that sold out. We rolled out an 8-week rock climbing program for middle school students that was $40 a person, sold out like that. We're really investing. You just have to set that opportunity, and to invest in municipalities or those who are enabling municipalities to be successful in these non-traditional, yet they're way older than all the other traditional sports we're selling into, to help bring the community out and see what's already available there. And to just let these companies doing this work pay themselves to do that work, because it's a hard decision to make, or even some guidelines even of like, hey, you can pay yourself X amount with this grant, something to let people do the work.
That's an excellent point. And again, goes to how do we remove those restrictions, right? Like, and understand the needs of the actual service providers. One of the questions I wanted to ask y'all is also appearing throughout our chat, is thinking about government dollars, right? So a lot of trust-based philanthropy, anything really new and innovative like this is oftentimes going to come from the private sector, which is more nimble, which is a space where you can sort of step out of the most traditionally walked path and try different things. And the risk assessment there is a little bit easier, right? So I'm curious, because government grants are so powerful at the state level, at the federal level, um, how do you, if you have experience with it, how do you think through the process of government granting in terms of how can we help incorporate trust-based philanthropy practices within that? Like, how would you recommend to the government to help improve it? And specifically, someone in our audience was asking, as a government employee, how do we encourage that risk taking when we are accountable for taxpayer dollars? And I identify with that very much because, as many of you know, I was a Fed for almost 15 years in environmental regulation and labor law. And for me, every penny is you hold accountable and you're very critical for it. So coming from that culture, how do we help encourage that within uh, governmental philanthropy? And I'm just going to open that up to y'all. And I think Les, you can start off with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Embry. Um, Man, I came from a background working in, as I mentioned, health and human services and county government, and in grant making to community-based organizations. And I definitely empathize with the question asked around, risk, and how do we promote innovation while also managing risk in government agencies. And the one thing that I would often highlight there is, really leaning into risk as learning, and talking about that on the front end of grant opportunities, talking about how you're investing in innovation. And there are opportunities, and I strategically call them opportunities for failure. Um, and learning as a result of that. So, that shouldn't keep government agencies from investing and from thinking strategically about its policies as well, right? So, one of the things that we often talked about in grant making, from the county perspective is, well, which organizations have the current budget to be able to manage this level of investment? And that is a common narrative that keeps community-based organizations that know their communities the best from accessing the resources that they need in order to get the essential work done. So really rethinking those policies, those structures, thinking about accessibility around the grant making process as well. But then the other thing I would mention, and one of the tools that government agencies use as well, are intermediary organizations, intermediary funders as well. So when you think about kind of the levels of risk, and Jill alluded to this earlier as well, right? You have government that, like, they have the highest threshold for risk management, have to be incredibly cautious. Then also corporate entities also have a level of risk that they're able to sustain. But also, as Jill mentioned, like, they don't have the capacity to be able to get to know, individual community-based organizations, or to micro grant in the same way that, say, an outdoor recreation roundtable and Together Outdoors is able to. And so, thinking about who are potential intermediary funders within your community, that could help to support your initiative as well, and that might be more nimble in how they grant make, and then also how they provide that technical assistance to community partners as well.
Well, you just teed me up perfectly to again flex a little bit about TO. Um, we actually did this with the great state of Maryland. As we were running the micro grant program, I saw applications coming in because I read every single one of the 300 plus applications and responded to them individually. Um, I saw there were several applications coming in for the state of Maryland, which is where I live right now. And so it was really incredible. We worked with Sandy Olick, who's the director of the Maryland Outdoor Rec Office. And through the leveraging of our public-private partnership that we entered into with them, they were able to let us administer this whole program where they cannot reach. And that makes sense. Like, government programs are the restrictions that exist for whether you're state or federal are congressionally mandated, as they should be, right? But that doesn't mean that there aren't other mechanisms. And like you said, public-private partnerships are a brilliant mechanism to help reach some of those places and exploring them and hearing best practices like this is a way of finding those solutions, because we need people within government systems to help propose these changes, right? And we need partners to stand next to them and say, we have the backing, we have the ability to do the administration. So I really love that suggestion. I don't know if Jill or Darren, you had anything to contribute. And then after that, I actually have a specific question for you, Jill.
Okay, I'll make it really quick. In my former life, I served in local government, and so I was on city council. And before that, I actually started volunteering, being on a human relations council. So just kind of going back to like, what are some simple or some tangible items that can happen as it relates to government, more specifically local government, is building the relationships. Going back to what Les said, right? How can you build the relationships with the potential grantees so that you can see what that trust looks like, but also making sure that as a government agency, what's your strategy? What are the goals that you're trying to accomplish? And then making sure that you are aligning with organizations who are at least moving in that direction, and also starting pilot programs, so that if something doesn't work in terms of being transparent, you can go back and say, this was a pilot, right? And this didn't work. But I think that if you can build those relationships up front, then you have an opportunity to really have a better sense. Like, you won't always get it right, and that can be a little bit more difficult in government. But if you take the time to build those relationships, use your human relations councils or arts commissions, different places, to really help do some of that research, then the risk will be minimized. But again, to Ambrine's point, it's also still a learning opportunity.
Absolutely. Like, I wrote this down. I'm going to frame it. I'm going to put it everywhere. I'm going to send it to my boss. I'm going to send it to the government with my taxes. Risk is learning. Yes. Yes. And this is something I have to underscore all the time, zooming out from philanthropic conversations. This is the work that we have to do in approaching inclusiveness and equity and diversity. Risk is learning. There is actually no formula for this. We have to learn as we go, and we have to be able to trust in our partners as we do this. And so the one question I had, we have about 15 minutes left, but I wanted to, before I turn it over to audience Q&A, I wanted to ask you, Jill, as being within a system and being such a vanguard for change, and I admire you so much because you've been such a champion for our work, but also just a lot of great social change in the movement overall. How do you approach, or how did you approach proposing these, what would be very non-traditional changes to traditional grant making within Winnebago Industries or in other capacities? Like, how did you approach taking those first few steps to make the donors feel safe enough to expand their understanding of impacts?
Yes. And so, what I'll say is that we do have a board of trustees that, helps to make the decisions. And I see one that's on the call, so I want to give him a shout out. I won't call his name. But, our board of trustees, they are very engaged in the work. They take their job seriously. And going back to that, the risk is learning. We try to approach the work that we do from a learning perspective, right? How can we learn? And so we take the time to, to share information, to bring in speakers and subject matter experts. And again, even with that, sometimes it's difficult. Like I said in the beginning, we're still on this journey, right? And I think somebody had a question, I believe, in the chat about impact and measurement. And we're currently going through that process. And so we're trying to figure out, how can we tell the stories of these great organizations without adding additional barriers, but telling the stories so that we can get additional funding to continue to do the work, right? So it's a push-pull between what it looks like for trust-based, because at the end of the day, we trust the organizations that we're funding, but we also want to tell the story. And so I think that, the small wins, we take it one win at a time to begin to show that, if we continue to build upon these wins, then we can do more, right? And so we're still learning, though. And I think that we have to be committed to do the learning and committed to being flexible and understanding that things can shift and change. But also to DJ's point, like we can't fund an organization that's not a 501c3. We just can't. We're not set up in that way, but we can fund a Together Outdoors to begin to see what that work looks like. So I think it's about learning. I think it's about relationship building. And then I think it's about, sharing out that impact and continuing to move the work forward.
Yeah, and that's so helpful because you see this sort of common theme amongst anyone who's in the universe of philanthropies. How do we convince the people who are giving us the dollars to give out that this is gonna work when the point is we're learning how to do the work, right? So one of the questions, one of the audience questions was directed at Winnebago Industries, but I do want the rest of you to chime in on this. And they were asking, how do you choose which orgs to support? Or do you approach them or do they approach you? And I know that in a lot of my learnings about trust-based philanthropy, there's a lot of conversation happening around how do you solicit applications? Can you do direct applications? How do you advertise? How do you go beyond your own networks? And that's a huge part of it too. And that's what TO really focused on is we know that there's a lot we don't know. So we want to go to the folks who are working within these spaces and ask them to help advertise that these opportunities exist. But I wanted you to speak on this, and Darren, from the other side, you've probably done all of the above. So I would love to hear y'all's experience with this, with that particular phase in the process. But you can start.
That was a lot. That was a lot, Amber, and I want to make sure I understand the exact question.
Winnebago Industries, the origin of the question being, how do you select the organizations that you're going to support? How do you reach them? And then I want to zoom out for the rest of you to also contribute to that in your personal capacities.
Perfect. So, what I would say is traditionally we have a link on our website where organizations can apply for funding. We recently had to change that to an invite only process because we're going through a restructure. And so how we select organizations are based on our strategy. Our strategy is for the outdoors and community access, sustainability, and education and workforce development. And so we try to fund organizations that are in those three pillars. We have, we have community go teams within our each one of our business locations. And so we share that information with our community go teams. We encourage them to tell other organizations about them. We use social media, but honestly, we don't have a massive budget. Like I wish we could do a huge, massive marketing campaign and like drive, tons of people to our site. But, our goal is to really focus in the areas where we live, work, and play. And so we just try to utilize our social media. We try to utilize our employees, and then our board of trustees, based on our pillars, then they make the funding, mostly make the funding decisions.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know. And what about you, Darren? Like, how do you approach thinking about this as someone who would want to apply? And how do you learn that information? And what would you recommend to Winnebago Industries or other funders in how to reach you better?
Sure. I would say take a look at the be honest when you're trying to create more customers, right? That's probably the biggest thing. If you're a for-profit company, I think we've maybe missed the mark in thinking about how to generate more customers as purely a DE&I issue. If we're just looking at our major urban population centers, and that if the goal is to then get them to rural communities to recreate, you got to meet them where they start. And that's a big thing that I'm doing here in Malden. I've identified just purely as a marketer when I was doing this for someone else's company before. We got to talk to people who haven't yet gone outside. And so to focus your efforts as both a foundation, nonprofit, or for-profit is making funds available, start with where the people are. If your goal is to create more customers eventually or a more diverse workforce, which helps you create more diverse goods and services to then sell to attract more new customers, you kind of got to start where the people are at. And I think that's really been overlooked. Urban population centers, that's where most people live. and that's where we're going to find your most diverse populations. It's also where we're going to find people really relying on public transit systems that are set up to help people with disabilities, another massive population that has been underserved by the outdoor industry. So that's probably the biggest thing that I've seen is a lack of, not focusing or looking for organizations that service those population centers right where they are. There's some great opportunities to take people further away, but it's got to be repeatable, in my opinion, to get people to be consistent with it. And then that workforce development, that's the last part. That's where I started, but that, in my opinion, should be the maybe third thing you get to. So working with an organization that says, look, phase one, I want to get people outside. Phase two, I want to keep them going outside. And phase three, I want them to find a job at your company. That's a great opportunity where you can get those benefits pretty quickly if you're willing to invest in a multi-year operation that says, I provided this money to help get folks outside with programming. But now at the end, I want you to help me get more people, more diverse folks to work at my company. And that's been the thing I think is really missing, and maybe not everyone. I think that helps on the government side, because when you start
Yeah.
talking, like, this journey for me has got me into a lot of other organizations, both politically and a bunch of other caucuses that are in the area that I did not know existed. When you start talking about workforce development, politicians' ears perk up. So whether, regardless of your status on here, I think for the government folks and the companies and foundations, let's make that the last piece, because that's how we get this all sustainable. Because your foundation doesn't want to be giving for the next 100 years to the same organization. So if we keep that in mind, starting with major urban population centers, gateway cities, and then having the end part of starting that journey into a career, it's going to get easier because we have more people now to work at that company and to advocate for building more diverse goods and services to ultimately do what we're all trying to do.
Yeah, and that's another excellent point is that, in approaching inclusive grant making, the ultimate goal is that we want to think about diversity at every level, from the board to the administrators of the grant, to the people who are reviewing the applications, to the applicants themselves. Every one of these stages needs cross-pollination from people who have diverse life experiences and community identities, because that informs the whole process, from who wants to be who's determining the investments to who is figuring out practices to do it right. And I'm curious, Les, if you wanted to speak on that, since your whole program is set up in a directed approach versus open applications, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And to, to some degree that it is pros and cons. And I think Jill said it earlier. We're still kind of figuring it out. This has been our process, though, of not necessarily doing an open application, but doing invitation only applications, because again, we went through that heat mapping process. We developed a list of 36 communities that are high priority communities for us to consider, and then we dive into conversation. We get into conversations with those communities. We also welcome conversations with organizations and individuals. We're regularly contacted about grant opportunities. One of the things that we always clarify, though, is we support collective impact. We unfortunately don't support direct programming. And so really understanding that we're looking for communities that are either trying to bring together a coalition or in the early stages of coalition development, and they're looking to add capacity to that. Those are the communities that we're engaging with the most. And then we also hear from foundations and from industry as well, from community foundations that reach out and say, hey, this Thrive Outside thing that you're doing that helped to get 95,000 kids outdoors last year, we'd love to see that in our community as well. Will you work with us in bringing together private philanthropy with corporate philanthropy, outdoor industry, to bring this initiative to our region as well? And so we welcome those conversations, but again, really focused on collective impact. And then the steps from there are, once we get to a point where we recognize, all right, this is an effort that is, in clear alignment with the Thrive Outside initiative, we'll invite a letter of intent. And then we work with the community, again, keeping that barrier really low, right? So a letter of intent, not trying to make organizations jump through crazy hoops in order to access funding. Um, and then from there, we work with communities on the development of the network plan after the award process. So it's engaging in conversations, engaging with key stakeholders, local community foundations, parks and rec departments, outdoor recreation organizations, environmental organizations, and then narrowing in on who's the community pointing to as a potential backbone organization to this network. And that takes a ton of time per community. But we're really grateful for that process and how it's helped to narrow us into the 13 communities and expanding over the next 4 years to 12 new communities. How that process has taken place, has unfolded.
I just want to jump in one quick and say something
Hey.
that we've all been kind of talking about here on the trust, and also answers one of the questions in the Q&A. If you have a more diverse board, staff, C-suite, foundation, that's where you get the trust, right? So much of trust has been over the years. I see someone who looks like me. Their story is like mine. Therefore, I trust them in a way that someone who is not of my background, I do not. And if you have people, if your organization lacks that diversity, you also lack a diversity in who you are trusting. And that's a bias you have to understand and overcome. So if you are trying to apply for something and get a foundation to understand that, hey, we want to use a trust-based model, find the person who works at that foundation. If someone it matches your background, and talk to them, hey, I know that you will trust me. So what can we do together? How can I build that coalition with you to get the rest of the board, the rest of the foundation, the rest of the organization to put us in line for that grant?
Yeah, and I think that that goes straight to the point of, where does trust come from? It comes from a sense of familiarity, right? That's at the center of all of this. And I was born and raised outside of the United States. I moved to the United States when I was young as an immigrant. And so I am very intrinsically aware of what it means to know when someone feels familiar with me or not. I've gone through a lot of spaces in my life where people aren't familiar with me, right? And so you need those type of social connections to understand someone. And when you are operating in a system without the diversity, it's a lot to expect your mind to go beyond what you know as familiar to understand other issues, other communities, and trust those approaches, right? So I completely agree with you. And unfortunately, we're down to our last 2 minutes, although I had questions for y'all to think about maybe in another conversation is like what is a measurement of success and impact that we can report out on in this white paper that I'm developing that'll come out next week, but just to think through something creative in that way. But I want to thank you all so much for your time and your wisdom and sharing all this out. Like, I can't emphasize enough that the things we've heard today from my friends are just gold. They're gold. Like, this is years of work and experience and pushing and grinding and being an advocate behind closed doors. So thank you all so much. And that goes for a lot of folks in the audience as well. Y'all are out there doing this work, and we'd love to hear from you in terms of what's working, what's not working, and continue to build this community. So thank you all so much. This session was recorded. I apologize for not mentioning that in the beginning. We are going to be posting this online. We'll be doing some social media so we can engage there as well in the comments, and look out for the announcement coming for our new grantees and what's next at Together Outdoors. So thank you all so much. Have a great day.